If your organization is full of smart people, strong managers, and a decent strategy, you would think urgency would go down as the company matures. A lot of the time, it does not. The company gets more capable, the people get better, the systems get more sophisticated, and somehow the place feels more rushed, more reactive, less able to think. That is usually not a talent problem. And it's not always a strategy problem either. A lot of high-performing organizations drift into urgency cycles because urgency, at some point, quietly became the operating system. And once that happens, the company doesn't just work under pressure, it starts needing pressure to work. That is when the pattern gets expensive. It stops living inside one leader, and now it lives in the organization. High-performing organizations are supposed to get more stable over time. That's the point of scaling. You hire stronger people, you clarify your roles, you improve your process, you clean up communication, and you invest in planning, and all of that is supposed to create one thing: execution reliability. But in a lot of companies, it creates something else. The company gets more complex, but not more calm, more staffed, but not more steady, more active, but not more clear. Meetings increase, escalations increase, check-ins increase, priorities multiply, timelines tighten, and the organization starts confusing movement with traction. That is one of the clearest signs that urgency is no longer occasional. It's becoming the environment people rely on for clarity. And once that happens, calm does not feel productive. Calm feels suspicious. A quiet week starts to feel like drift. A stable quarter starts to feel like slippage. A team that is not scrambling starts to look underused. So the system creates more movement to restore orientation. Not because the people are careless, because the organization has learned that pressure makes everyone feel more certain. That's the part executives miss. Organizations inherit the calibration of their leaders. People do not just follow instructions, they adapt to repeated conditions. If the clearest moments in the company always happen during pressure, people learn something fast. Urgency is when priorities become real. Urgency is when decisions finally get made. Urgency is when authority becomes visible. Urgency is when the truth comes out. So even if nobody says it out loud, the company absorbs the rule. Nothing really counts until it becomes urgent. That rule changes everything. Teams hesitate because they expect priorities to move. Managers postpone hard trade-off decisions because escalation will force clarity later. Functions stop trusting the calm version of strategy because the urgent version always wins. And at that point, the company is not using urgency as a tool. Urgency is shaping decision pacing, coordination, and attention across the whole system. That is why these organizations can look impressive from the outside. Fast, responsive, intense, always moving. But inside, the experience is different. People are working hard without getting stable returns on that effort. They're operating in a place where clarity keeps getting reissued under pressure. Now, urgency cycles are not the same thing as a busy season. Every real company has periods of load. That's normal. We all know that. The problem is when urgency becomes the recurring mechanism that restores focus. Here is what that usually looks like. First, there is a calm period. No major fire, no obvious breakdown, no external shock. On paper, this should be when strategic work compounds. Planning gets better. Cross-functional alignment gets cleaner. Systems get refined. Important but non-urgent work finally moves. But instead, something starts happening. Leaders get uneasy with the pace. Managers surface more issues. Standards tighten in the middle of execution. More meetings get added just to stay aligned. Projects that were fine suddenly feel questionable. Teams get asked for more updates, more visibility, more proof, and now pressure starts rising again. Not always through one big dramatic event, sometimes through 100 smaller signals. A sharper tone in meetings, a compressed deadline, a new review layer, a sudden shift in what matters most, a general feeling that everybody needs to move faster now. Then something predictable happens. People get sharper, execution speeds up, response times improve, decision bottlenecks temporarily clear, leadership presence becomes more concentrated, and because the system feels more coherent under pressure, everyone reads that coherence as proof. See, this is what gets us moving. This is the trap. The organization mistakes activation for effectiveness. And because pressure really did restore short-term clarity, the system becomes more likely to recreate the same conditions again. That is how urgency cycles become self-reinforcing. A lot of executives think the cost of this pattern is stress. And I mean, let's be real, stress is part of it, but it's not the real cost. The real cost is compounding instability in the way the organization thinks and operates. First, strategy time collapses into urgent execution. The company keeps saying it wants to focus on long-range priorities, but every time stability appears, urgent work expands and eats the room. Strategic conversations get shortened. Important conversations get delayed until they become painful. Operating reviews turn into status triage instead of directional thinking, so the company stays busy while slowly losing leverage. Second, decision pacing gets distorted. Some decisions take too long because no one trusts calm clarity. Other decisions happen too fast because pressure creates temporary certainty. So the rhythm becomes strange. Delay, execute, rush, regret, revisit. Third, execution reliability begins to weaken. Not because people are incapable, but because teams learn to organize around disruption instead of continuity. They get excellent at catching fire, less effective at building systems that hold. Fourth, talent starts adapting to the wrong thing. Your strongest operators either become firefighters or they start pulling back. Some people get attached to the speed because it's the only environment where they feel important. Others quietly lose trust because they realize good planning does not actually protect their work. And then leadership starts paying for the pattern in ways it does not always trace back correctly. Retention drag, rework, overmanagement, cross-functional friction, reduced initiative, a slow decline in strategic confidence. From the outside, it can still look like a high-performance culture, Inside, it feels like the company cannot stay clear unless something is on fire. This is where smart leaders get fooled, because urgency does create a real effect. It can make people more alert, more decisive, more communicative, more willing to move. So if you keep watching pressure create focus, it's easy to draw the wrong conclusion. You start thinking the problem is not enough intensity. So you add more pressure signals. You raise the bar again. You increase scrutiny. You compress timelines. You stay highly involved. You signal seriousness by increasing the tempo. And in the short term, that often works. That is what makes this pattern expensive. It doesn't look dysfunctional at first. It can look like strong leadership, high standards, operational seriousness, but what it is actually teaching the company is this: stability is not trustworthy. Only the urgent is. And once people learn that, they stop building around steady clarity. They start building around escalation. This is where the pressure holding capacity becomes useful. Some leaders and organizations are stimulus calibrated. Clarity improves when pressure increases. Urgency restores orientation. Calm feels ambiguous. Stability can feel like erosion. Other leaders and organizations are regulation calibrated. Clarity holds regardless of the environment. Decision quality stays intact under load. Execution does not need artificial pressure to stay sharp. Stability compounds instead of feeling threatening. That distinction matters because a company will drift toward the calibration it experiences most often at the top. If the top of the system keeps producing clarity through escalation, the rest of the system will normalize escalation. If the top of the system can remain clear without urgency, the rest of the company has a chance to build stable execution rhythms. So the real question is not just, are we performing? The better question is, what conditions does our performance depend on? Because if best execution only shows up under pressure, then your company is not actually stable. It is activated. And activated systems are expensive to scale. This is where the issue stops being personal and starts being strategic. A company trapped in urgency cycles cannot fully benefit from operational excellence because process discipline does not compound inside a system that keeps resetting itself through escalation. You can install better planning tools. You can redesign meetings. You can rewrite accountability structures. You can hire more experienced operators. All of that matters. But if urgency is still the operating system, those improvements will struggle to hold. The culture will keep pulling execution back toward pressure-dependent clarity. That is why some organizations invest in better management infrastructure and still feel strangely unstable. The visible systems improve. The underlying calibration does not. And when calibration does not change, volatility keeps leaking back in through decision pacing, leadership behavior, and cross-functional tension. This pattern shows up all the time in executive teams that are scaling quickly. Not because they're weak, but because growth exposes whether clarity is stable or pressure dependent. And companies that do not answer that question early usually pay for it later in fatigue, turnover, and stalled compounding. So what do you do with this? You do not solve it by telling everybody to calm down, right? You solve it by changing what the organization experiences as normal. Normal should not be confusion, then pressure, then temporary clarity. Normal should be stable priorities, clean decision pacing, and execution that does not require artificial acceleration to stay sharp. That means leaders need to pay attention to what they reinforce. When you intervene, are you creating clarity or proving the system cannot hold without you? When you accelerate the room, are you increasing effectiveness or teaching people to wait for pressure? When things are stable, can the organization keep moving without inventing a reason to panic? That is the threshold, because scale does not come from a company that occasionally becomes brilliant during crisis. Scale comes from an organization that can remain clear when nothing is wrong. And if that feels harder than it should, the issue may not be capability. It may be that urgency has become your operating system, and the organizations that scale best are the ones that learn how to replace that with regulation-calibrated execution. That is where real compounding begins.